Good afternoon, everyone. Today is a special day because a friend of mine is joining us for discussing her PhD thesis. I have known Amulya since for about a decade, and it has been a constant, inspiring journey. Where I've got the opportunity to learn from her so many times, and I think it is a privilege today to actually listen to her amidst all the scholars from India. Uh, Before we begin with the introductions, let me give a brief introduction about Association of Indian Research Scholars. Now, Association of Indian Research Scholars have been active since September 2020, and we have successfully hosted eminent scholars from across the world, including Professor Noam Chomsky, Professor Hargopal, Professor Joseph Nye, Professor Rajan Harshe, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Afroz Alam, and Professor Muhammad Mozam Ali, to name a few. We have also released two newsletters, which included not just webinar reports but also opinion pieces by scholars from across India. If you have any piece that you are interested in publishing with us, do consider sending it to our official mail. We are also available on all social media platforms, so do connect, share, and like, and also subscribe to our channel to listen to such young, energetic research scholars. Now, to introduce the speaker for today, let me take few minutes to uh, gather my thoughts. So, Amulya, doctor, now she's a doctor. I'm so sorry, I keep forgetting to add that. So, now that she's a doctor, let me begin with that. Dr. Sai Amulya Komarraju is a postdoctoral researcher at CDMC Mika. She's also the sector leader, salon work at femlab.co. She has recently been awarded a research grant from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, SCIS, University of Witwatersrand, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, to examine the experiences of male workers in highly feminized professions of domestic and saloon work within and outside of platform. Her intersectional feminist work in the area of global digital cultures, future of workers, and critical algorithm studies have been published in international journals such as Feminist Media Studies and Media Culture and Society. With this introduction, let me hand it over to Amulya. Amulya, over to you.
Hi, everyone. A very good evening to one and all. Firstly, I'd like to apologize for the horrible Dell camera placement. The camera is on the bottom left corner, and I keep looking at the screen, so apologies for that. Now, when Ariba approached me to talk about my doctoral work, um, I thought it was a great idea because one, I'd get to speak about my work, and also the fact. When I was thinking about ideas about how to present this work, for me, I'm given to understand that the platform's audience mostly consists of research scholars. So I thought maybe I should do it the way I've written my dissertation, introduction, methodology, and then go into the empirical work, so that it might be of use to doctoral researchers at various stages who are watching this or who will watch this, hopefully. So I'll briefly talk about my understanding of feminism, how I come into feminism, and then about the empirical work. So, what was the basis of my study? What were the burning questions that I wanted to ask? Um, and then qualitative research and feminist methodology choice for that. And then the media part of the discussion, which may have grabbed a few eyeballs, which is about how millennials understand feminism or how people understand feminism in general. So, about me, researcher's positionality. I grew up in an ordinary middle class family. Now, the category of middle class is difficult to define, and I acknowledge that, but I'll attempt to define it in any way in just a bit. So, growing up, I had never heard of feminism. I think the first time I heard about feminism was during my undergraduate program, and Ariba can agree with this. We had something called feminist literature as part of our BA program. We read Suniti Nam Joshi's Feminist Fables and Bharti Mukherjee's wife. It spoke to my experiences and expectations from me based on my gender in familial settings, expectations from the society. I mean, general things like girls must choose certain clothes, they must do certain things, they must look a certain way. And I remember when my mother quit her job to take care of us, um, we never questioned it. It was so natural for the mother to quit job because, mothers do care work. At least now we're calling it care work. Back then it was just, mothers, what do? They mother. And fathers work, sort of a thing, right? So there was no question. It was just very natural for my mother to stay back at home. There was no question about asking my mom if that was her choice. If she would like to do it differently, if perhaps my father should take care of us for a little while, because it goes against the grain. And also, like, girls are not supposed to go out in the evening, they're supposed to be at home for most part. And caste was never discussed at home at all, which speaks to my privilege and location. So during my MA, I had a professor called Professor. I had a professor, Professor Kanchan Malik. She works at the Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad. She had asked students whose mothers worked to raise their hands, and I didn't raise my hand because by then my mother had quit her job, right? So few of them raised their hands, and then Kanchan ma'am looked at all of us and very seriously she asked, "So do you think your mothers don't work at home? There's no work at home at all. What do they do after they wake up?" So we were sort of, talking about what all work mothers do at home, and women, not just mothers, but women do at home. They wake up, they make coffee, they cook, they send their children to school if they're mothers. So, and it is all work, right? So that was the first time I started to think about these dominant notions around work and the invisible work that women, not just mothers, the invisible work that women do. Another significant turning point for me was the clear distinction made between gender, which is masculinities and femininities in plural, which is a social construction, and sex, which is biological construction, very deterministic. And I have no problem and qualms in saying that that was the first time in MA course that I was hearing about the distinction between these two things. I don't remember it being defined in my biology textbooks in ninth and 10th. Um, so and then I also had a professor, Professor Usha Raman, who went on to become my MA thesis supervisor. And there for my MA thesis, I looked at performance of cells on fashion blogs, and there was a point at which I wanted to look at it from a feminist lens, but that did not happen. And instead, what I did was I looked at online feminism, which was just taking off in India, so to speak. And Professor Raman was my supervisor for that as well. And then she went on to become my PhD supervisor. So it's thanks to her that I actually could do my PhD. So around the same time in MA, we had a series of talks about feminism. We learned about these landmark moments in Indian women's movement, the Mathura rape case, the Banwari Devi case, which is really the first Me Too case in India, as Kalpana Kanabiran remarks. We also studied or heard about Ramiza B, Meera Tyagi. Now, these were all moments of churning, right, for Indian feminists who largely belonged to the dominant castes and classes. They were being confronted with the fact that the category of women is not so simplistic, is not monolithic. There are different vectors of identities, and it isn't as simple as saying that women are oppressed, like a blanket statement, especially in deeply fragmented society like ours, where oppression is experienced at the intersection of gender, at the intersection of gender, class, caste, religion, ethnicity, disability, and even age and race in Western contexts. Although race is definitely an issue here as well. So I kept thinking about how my home would have been different if I were aware of these heated discussions within academia that were taking place in the 90s about caste, about gender, about disability. All of these were happening, and how would my experience at home be any different? Would my mother and I have shared a different relationship? Because as a consequence of my MA program, I started exchanging notes from the lectures that I'd heard, from the books that I'd read, and we seemed to, at some point, we had a closer relationship, and we were thinking about these things. My mother and I, we were thinking about these things. And then a momentous thing happened. Just as I graduated, the 2012 Delhi rape case, it caused a huge furore. The media dubbed the victim, and I'm using the word victim here because Jyoti Singh, she passed away soon after. So the media dubbed her as Nirbhaya, the courageous woman who lost her life battling rapists. Um, And she lost her life. Why? Because she fought hard to protect her izzat. And this became like a huge thing. Everybody was talking about how she fought for her life, fought with her life, and ultimately she died because she fought a rapist, in her efforts to protect her izzat or honor, right? But something interesting was happening. People from the middle classes were mobilizing, and there seemed to be a renewed interest in feminism in India. For instance, the page Feminism for Hyderabad, Hyderabad for Feminism, sorry, is just one example of it. So not only was there not that there was no feminist activism at all at that point. Online feminism did have its moments, but the public discourse around feminism, harassment, activism, this grew. And I remember very distinctly, Sanjay Srivastava wrote about aggressive masculinity, and how the city shone like a beacon for women who wanted to work and enjoy, but the loss of maleness based on being primary earner of the family was causing resentment amongst males. And around the same time, Kavita Krishnan's Bake Off Azadi also became the slogan. And all of a sudden, these discussions became a part of dining tables at my home. I mean, my mother and I were discussing these things, but never in the presence of my father or my brother. And I was noticing that a lot of my cousins were also doing the same thing. They were having these conversations at home, at their homes, and this was something that was happening at a large scale. So that's what Jyoti Singh's rape case did. We were all speaking about this at our homes, but there was still something missing. Around that time, Dalit feminists also said that Jyoti Singh's identity of being a middle class, upper caste person was the only reason for such mobilization. Um, and they were talking about how perpetrators of violence are punished when they belong to disadvantaged castes and classes, because people who are from privileged backgrounds, they tend to get away with it. But not many were engaging with this discourse. And I thought that it would be interesting to see how people understand feminism. What is feminism for them? For me, it took a whole lot of unlearning to understand that feminism is really about intersectionality of identities. It's about gender. It's not as simplistic as saying that women are oppressed. But these conversations don't enter in popular discourse as much, although there is an effort to do so. And I googled to see if if there was any scholarship at all about how people understand feminism in India. And to my surprise, what I found that there were a lot of doctoral research projects that looked at how people understand and engage with feminism in the West, but there was very less work here in India. Despite the fact that there have been many years of thriving women's movements, um, there was really no scholarship that looked at how people engage with feminism at the everyday level. And the kind of scholarship that does exist, for instance, Chila Bulbeck's work on feminism in Asia. Then there's also Aditi Mitra's work and Shilpa Phadke's work. But these are either qualitative, like Chila Bulbeck's work is, quantitative. Chila Bulbeck's work is quantitative in nature, and it misses on the in-depth engagement about why people are thinking about feminism in a particular manner, their roots to feminism, why they come into it or not. Or these kind of studies are limited to students and activists who are exposed to feminist theory to some degree. For instance, Aditi Mitra's work is really about feminist activists. And Shilpa Phadke's work is about how her students engage with feminism, and these students are exposed to feminist theory because it's a part of their course. So my intention really was to examine how ordinary middle classes, here I'm borrowing very loosely from Kanabiran's work, ordinary middle classes is a descriptor to mean that these are people who are cut off from the academic activist network. So, how are ordinary middle classes understanding feminism and their roots to it? I then thought about it, and I thought, okay, let me also ask, because feminism is also is to do with gender, right? So I was thinking, what are people's views about gender, gender politics, and feminism, and also to look at feminist mothering, because I was thinking about my relationship with my mother and how it would have been different had we, read about feminism or had been a part of the movement, right? So, for me, the basic questions that I wanted to ask were, what are the specific experiences and exposures that contribute to Hyderabad millennials understanding subjective understanding of feminisms. And the second question was, what are the specific experiences and exposure that contribute to subjective understanding of gender? And what does feminist mothering look like in the Indian context? What is the content and expected outcomes of feminist mothering? Now, I realize that these are all three different questions, and they could have formed the basis of three different dissertations, three separate dissertations. But I stuck with it, right? Because I was really interested in all of this, and I stayed with the challenge of seeing how I could connect these three different kinds of questions. And then I realized that the resulting work can be likened to a patchwork quilt, which I borrowed from Deleuze's work. So just as different pieces make sense on their own, but they can be put together to craft a story. To each narrative and phase made sense on its own. Each question made a sense on its own, but there was a way to put these things together, um, like the patchwork quilt. And then one could pick up any chapter in the thesis and read it as a standalone piece, including the discussion chapter, which really talks about the interlinks between these three separate questions on masculinities, femininities, feminisms, and feminist mothering. And what was brilliant, if I can say so myself, about the measure of the patchwork is that, feminist politics has no center from which everything flows. And I felt that the quilt offers a similar description. Each part of the quilt is important, is crucial, and there is no center of the quilt, right? Um, and also because I think, in part, just as the quilt maker is responsible for bringing different pieces together in a design that she likes or he likes, so does the qualitative researcher, a qualitative feminist researcher, whose theory is dependent on the data that she collects, and the experiences and skills that she brings to the table, and then crafting it into a story. And this story could be, one of the many that can be told, or the same story that can be told differently. Perhaps somebody else who does this research, or who if there was somebody else who'd done this research, the resulting story could have been very different. So here, I also acknowledged my own positionality, my own thinking as a researcher. My experiences and exposure have also shaped this research. So the dominant anthropological way of doing research, ethnography, is to go to a field where you're an outsider, you observe, you learn, you write. So this is based on very masculinist assumptions, and for the longest time, quantitative research was the way to do research, right? Objectivity was supreme, generalizability was to be the aim of research. But feminist methodology is different. For most part, feminist methodology is qualitative. It doesn't dismiss mixed research, but it is qualitative for most part. So, what is feminist methodology really, and why did I employ it for this research? One, of course, because the questions were about feminism, and I also self-identify as a feminist, so that choice was pretty easy. I mean, duh. So the way it began, so the way feminist methodology begins, is with a critique of androcentrism, right? So Sandra Harding, Dorothy Smith, they all talk about taking seriously the everyday experiences of women. So in doing so, feminist scholarship unders a lot of dichotomies like body and mind, truth and experience, insider, outsider, public and private. And this is how really the personal was correctly recognized as political. So, with feminist scholars from diverse backgrounds engaging deeply with women's lives, and looking at women's lives more centrally, this contributed to the understanding that women are not a monolithic, homogeneous category. And this also informs critical masculinities theorists and scholars who likewise argue that men are not monolithic, homogeneous category either. So, with this in mind, I said millennials, but I was looking at how men and women in Hyderabad understand feminism. Now, when I say men and women, it was with the recognition that they're not monolithic categories. And I actually looked forward to speaking with those who identify as a part of LGBTQ community, but that did not materialize. Um, uh, which I had to make peace with. Now, qualitative research is like that. You go in with certain assumptions, you go in with certain expectations, but really the test of a researcher is how you adapt to those situations and make it work, right? So here I come to choices and boundaries. So doing research is also essentially about setting boundaries and choosing wisely for political purposes and also for practical purposes. So one might ask, why Hyderabad, right? Why did I choose to study Hyderabad? Why the middle classes? So one thing is, you can't, as a researcher, you can't uh, aim to understand everything about a certain topic or an issue, everything about a certain phenomena. You have to pick and choose. Now I was interested in middle classes because these sections of the populations are the ones that mobilize themselves following Nirbhaya. And I'm only calling it Nirbhaya because the media dubbed her so. Otherwise, I'm against calling her Nirbhaya. It just has a lot of upper caste, middle class connotations. And also because most feminists in India do belong to and identify themselves as middle classes. So I chose to work with middle class, and it also helped that I myself am from middle class. And diverse sections of population in Hyderabad. In Hyderabad, there are like diverse population, right? There are Gujaratis, there are Marathis, there are Muslims, there are Christians, there are Hindus, there are Buddhists. So I felt like Hyderabad was a great micro example of the kind of diversity that exists across India. And Now back to middle classes. How did I define middle classes? Because so I think about anybody you speak with, they would identify themselves as middle class. So it's not possible, or it was not feasible for me to understand middle classes as an economic category, but I thought of middle classes as a socio-cultural milieu. You know, those who are English speaking, educational skill oriented, including the new middle classes, which is really the IT population. And why Hyderabad? One, practically speaking, I can understand Deccani Hindi, I can understand Telugu, whether it's Andhra or Telangana, and of course, these are the languages that are dominantly spoken in the region. But there was also a practical reason, which is when I started the research, I did not have the financial resources to go and conduct, like, you know, typical ethnographer going out of the city, going to some other place which is strange and new, and then trying to find a foothold and conduct research. So that was the practical purpose. But there was a political purpose that trumped all of this. The political purpose is this, that Hyderabad has been pivotal in shaping of the Indian women's movement. The Ramiza based case happened here, and it was a for the and it brought about, and it caused a huge churning within the feminist community, academic activist feminist community, who really thought about, you know, women are not a monolithic category. So which is why I chose Hyderabad. Now, in asking these questions, in asking the question of how people understand feminism, I was looking at the popular, or rather the non-academic understanding of feminism amongst millennials, that is aged 18 to 25, and the need or lack thereof in their view of feminism and how they learn about it. And when I say popular, I use it in three ways, and this is how the word popular is used in media studies: as visibility in media, as a terrain of contested meanings. Here, media studies borrows from Stuart Hall. And as literal popularity. You know, a lot of people talking about feminism. So, what is feminism really? What is this popularity of feminism? What does it mean? So, it is in the last two ways, visibility in media and as literal popularity, that I use popular in this context. And if you really think about it, so far what I've spoken about is how to recognize lacuna in scholarship. So now you're interested in something. How do you make it work? How do you come up with questions? Now, I could have just asked, what does feminism mean to people? That could have been a dissertation, but feminism is about gender as well. So it made sense to ask about how people are thinking about gender, right? So first, you recognize lacuna in scholarship. And then, because research is also about adding depth to something that you already know about, so you do these two things. You answer questions that have been missing in scholarship, and you try to enhance the understanding, or you try to engage with the existing scholarship to push the boundaries of it. And then I've also spoken about how, very broadly, in brush strokes, how you choose a methodology. And now to methods. Now, the questions that I'm asking about exposure and experiences of people, they're to do with lived experiences of people, right? So it's a very qualitative question. So that method, the choice of method was very, very obvious to me. I had to work with qualitative research methods. Now, how do you do this? One, I found that focus group discussions are very, very insightful in terms of noting the kind of intergroup dynamics. How are people understanding feminism? Is there an argument there? Are people taking sides? So focus group discussions would be a great way. This is how I was thinking. And then, of course, phenomenological interviews, because I was talking about lived experiences of people. I needed something that would speak to those contexts as well. So phenomenological interviews, and in-depth interviews with feminist mothers, because I was interested in finding out how they're mothering. And I could not have done that through quantitative research methods by asking a survey, because I wasn't talking about numbers. In the course of this research, I spoke to students and professionals from various backgrounds. And for feminist mothering, here I depart from the argument that I make about ordinary middle classes, right? Ordinary middle classes are those people who do not belong to the academic activist network. um, when I set out to ask about feminist mothering, I had hoped to actually engage with people who were outside of these networks. But it so happened that through the course of the research, the feminist mothers I spoke with, now these feminist mothers self identified as feminists, therefore feminist mothers, they happened to be from the academia. So it departed from how I pictured my dissertation would be and who it would engage with. But these were the circumstances, and I had to handle that, right? So just to make sure that the audiences understand that feminist mothers in the study belong to the academic activist network for most part. um, and so I conducted focus groups, I conducted in-depth interviews and phenological interviews, which involved meeting a participant multiple number of times to sort of understand their life journey, their experiences and their exposure to media, to peers, to people in school. So different communities that they belong to, and how all of this shaped their understanding of gender, gender politics, and feminism. So when I began focus group discussions, it was very interesting for me because a lot of scholarship, like Chilla Bulbeck's work, it says that feminism is very popular. But what was interesting is that some participants had never heard of the word feminism at all. And right in the very beginning, right at the outset, I decided that I would not use vernacular terms like Narivad and Shrivadam. Narivad is, both of them are Hindi and Telugu respectively. I didn't want to use them as prompts to sort of nudge people into understanding feminism. I wanted, because they've not heard of feminism at all, I wanted that to come up organically, the understanding of it to come up organically from their own context. And also the fact that I had never heard of feminism, it worked in my favor because I was able to allay participants' fears that they were unfit for research. So that's very important. In qualitative research, you have to make the effort to connect with your participants to sort of understand where they're coming from, and to also be aware of your own understandings and your own experiences. And this is really to be accountable, right? Be self-reflexive and accountable. And you have to understand how your interpretation might be different from those of the participants. So it's always important to do member check, to ask them if this is what they meant. Because qualitative research is interpretation of interpretation, and feminist research does talk about how a researcher's understanding experiences affects research, but doesn't mean that it's all about your own subjectivity, but to be accountable to your participants as well. So when participants told me that they'd not heard of feminism before, first I allayed their fears and I said, it's fine, let's just talk about it. And like I said, I didn't use the vernacular terms. One is because, if you use these words devoid of the political context in which they're spoken, then people usually take the literal translation of it. For instance, Nivedita Menon, a feminist scholar, says that Stri Sahashakti Kiran, which is favored by government officials, has no political edge at all when compared to terms like Narivad and Shrivadam. But unfortunately, if you think about it, if you think of Narivad and Shrivadam without any context, the literal translation would be argument on behalf of women. But we know for a fact that feminism is not just about women, right? It's about feminism has to be intersectional if it has to mean something. It has to recognize that gender is one of the many layers of oppression, and how a Muslim woman from the working classes might experience oppression, or how a Dalit woman who belongs to working class might experience oppression is very different from the oppression that, say, an upper caste, upper middle class woman would face, right? So in fact, if you think about it, Patricia Hill Collins and Dalit feminist scholars talk about how perhaps men from the working classes um, have similar experiences. Dalit men from working classes have similar experiences to that of women, Dalit women from working class, right? So I'm transgressing, but yeah, to be digressing, sorry. So coming back to Narivad and Shivadam, so I did not use these words at all. And in spite of not using these terms, feminism was still understood in the context of the government's efforts to work on behalf of women. So they were drawing on these news pieces about, about young youth parliament that happened in 2014, if I'm not 2015, if I'm not wrong. And in the absence of the historical context of feminism and feminist movements, because they're not heard of women's movements at all, participants drew upon their local context to understand what a fight for women's rights would look like, because they broke down the word feminism. Fem, it's to do with feminine, is it to do with feminine, and then about women. So that is how they understood feminism, to do with women. And then they broke down the word and they said this is about femininity, and they understood it as an act that is related to women, and they said that they'd read about it in civics. um, uh, they said that it was a part of the curriculum, and they spoke about government initiatives that act on the spirit of constitutionally granted rights of women, and understood feminism as a reaction to systemic inequalities. Now, see, feminist movements have mostly relied on political practice of collective or mass protests and dharnas, and this was very popular through from 1970s through 1990s. But they experienced multiple fractures, because there was a lot of critique about, who counts as a woman, who's going to fight for her rights, and there was also sexuality, the rise of caste and sexuality politics that took place in the 90s. So because of that, you see, protests, collectivization is sort of has not been very popular in the 2000s, at least, before the revival of interest in feminism. Because of internal self-reflexivity and internal engagement with the chasms within feminist community, collectivization was not happening at that level. So the only sources through which participants could have heard about feminism is, of course, through media, right? Through the news that they were reading, through news articles, print, electronic, whatever, and at a later point, of course, Google, who's everybody's uncle or auntie or whatever you want to call it. So this yeah So this really, the internal fragmentation limited the potential of women's organization to gather forces like they used to do in the period that is described as the golden period of feminist activism in India. So in the absence of such a political tradition, then participants drew their understanding of feminism from available discourses about feminism, of which state feminism or national development feminism is a part of. And individuals in other groups, participants in other groups who had heard of feminism prior to the discussion, also understood feminism as women's rights, very similar to those who had never heard of feminism before. They understood it as gender equality. Now, I have to say that Shilpa Phadke, she cautions against the understanding of feminism as gender equality. Why? Because it can be easily hijacked and institutionalized by the state without offering any political critique of patriarchal power relations and the subsequent need for structural and systemic change. A term such as gender that is really of critical value to feminists, because of its destabilizing potential, it is stabilized and conflated with women by national development feminists, right? So without addressing patriarchal assumptions that lead to systemic and structural injustices, the word feminism, either it's not used or it is conflated with women's rights and gender equality. But this is exactly how participants seem to understand feminism, as either women's rights or as gender equality. But one good thing about their discussions was that they pointed out feminism, the onset of feminism, which they thought was very new, is a consequence of patriarchy that valorizes sons and masculinities and devalues girls and femininities. So, female participants recounted everyday experiences from within their own family to support their argument about the restrictions placed on girls because of their gender. And I think because the discussion took place in the aftermath of the 2012 rape case, a lot of the discussion was centered around azadi, around freedom. Freedom to do what, basically, in terms of clothing or even mobility, access to public spaces, about education, profession. And they also spoke about parents penchant to control female sexuality, right? So girls and women in Hyderabad, like the girls in Mumbai in Shilpa Phatke's work, they know that their freedom is subject to knowing the limits, the restrictions that often don't apply to their brothers. So they were talking about how discrimination exists in the family. So they had spoken about feminism as women's rights that's enshrined in the constitution. They had spoken about the youth parliament. They had also spoken about feminism in relation with media. They had spoken about women in relationship with gender equality, and ultimately what they're talking about was their own context, the familial context and feminism, and what feminism meant for them. And here is what is so interesting, is that they didn't say that there was no need for feminism. I spoke to male participants, I'll come to that as well. The female participants and the male participants, actually, they didn't say that feminism was not needed. They didn't say that feminism, if it means women's rights, had already been achieved, is what post-feminist scholarship talks about, right? A lot of people in the Western context understand that feminism has achieved what it is supposed to achieve. But in India, that's different. That's not how they understand. They feel that feminism is relevant. And girls and boys, both of them, spoke about their own immediate context of the family, of friends, friends in college or school, their workplace, to understand why feminism is still relevant. In terms of home and familial life, it was because of the limits and restrictions placed on women's access to public spaces. Really, azadi to do that, right? To go out late in the evening. That but what was also problematic is that there was also recognition amongst the girls that there is restriction placed on women's access to public spaces, or that they were not allowed after a certain point of time because they would be attracted to boys or men. And although, if you really think about it, why would attraction to boys and men be problematic? One is, of course, because it's anti-morality, right? But also, if you really think about Indian society and the fragmented lives that we lead, it's also to put a stop to intercaste, interreligious marriages. But did that come up in the discussions? No, except for one young adult who raised the question of caste. Not many of them were interested in that discourse, which really again tells us that if you're depending on government initiatives to understand feminism, or if you're dependent on popular media, on popular culture and media to understand what feminism means, then because more popularly, feminism is spoken in terms of gender equality, you wouldn't hear about caste. Now, this is something that feminists are trying to address. Academic activist feminists are trying to address. But for most part, the current popular discourses around feminism don't touch issues of caste and class. It's just about blanket. It's just understood in a very linear term of feminism is equal to women's rights and gender equality. So participants explained, but what is again interesting is participants who spoke about restrictions placed on them. In a weird way, they were okay with restrictions because they define feminism as not just as gender equality but also in terms of what it is not. They told me that feminism is not about being anti-men or anti-morality. Restrictions on women is fine. Okay. If it means that they'll be within limits. There's a very popular phrase, right? Women must be within limits, and these limits have to do with middle classes understanding of respectability, of honor, of izzat, and they wanted to toe that line. But did they want to toe the line completely? No. In their own spaces, in their own ways, which I really understood only when I did in-depth interviews with participants. In their own ways, they were trying to push the notion of what respectability means, what honor means. But for most part, they were like, harassment and violence against women is a reality, and they try to understand why parents would place these restrictions on them. It is to protect them. Again, it was not about their right, but it was in a very protectionist way. Now, again, why would participants talk about protectionism? Because that is how the public discourse around women's safety is. You don't talk about women's right to public spaces unless it's coming from a feminist perspective, like she teams in Hyderabad. They depend on the protectionist discourse. They do talk about protecting women. It's not about protecting women. It's about giving them their right to public spaces. And they also spoke about how feminism is relevant because it would lead to a change in mindset, right? Things are changing according to them, because parents are allowing students to choose their profession, to choose their courses, to go out, however limited that freedom is. But things are changing, but things would change further only when mindsets change. And who is in charge of changing the mindset? It's the girl herself. Now, this was coming from female participants. Female participants said that we must be in charge of changing our own mindsets first. We must learn to realize that being girls does not mean that you're in a place of powerlessness, but that you have power to do, to choose to do some things, and then to change the mindset of your parents. So yeah, so this in neoliberal scholarship, it's called psychologizing change, right? Changing your mindset in order to see a social change, concrete social change. Young women, in an odd way, thought of parents as being susceptible and vulnerable to messages from society, because you live in a society, and this society consists of different communities of practice. For instance, the church that you attend, or the mosque that you go to, or the temple that you go to, right? These are all communities of practice, religious practice, or even school that you go to, various sources of socialization. So all these communities influence parents in the wrong manner. So it was very fascinating to see how they were sort of talking about parents as susceptible and vulnerable to messages from society, and that change must begin with the girls first, who then must change their families' mindsets. So the stress on this change of mindsets, beginning with themselves at home. This is a popular Telugu quote, "Inte gelchi racha gelvali," which is conquer home first and then outside. This finds resonance with the report submitted by Justice Verma Commission that recommends that a social norms-based change is the only way to achieve meaningful social change, revealing the limits of law-based changes. Because you can have any number of laws, but if the thinking is flawed, then social change becomes really difficult. Which is why when a lot of people talk about how is social change brought about, they speak about these four. Lessig, for instance, talks about law. He talks about architecture. He talks about and one of the things that he talks about is social norms. If social norms change, then it means that change is happening at a granular level, and it takes a lot of time. So even though feminist scholarship regards material improvements in women's life as suspect, because it's a result of co-optation by various conservative forces and capitalist forces, young women took a more hopeful view of this. They credited feminism, which has already set into motion cultural changes. Uh, Regarding the inequitable opportunities between men and women, which guides governmental initiatives. It creates the space for dialogue on wage gap at the macro level, for encouraging them to change their mindsets and that of their families. So they took a very hopeful view. Unlike the individual focus of neoliberalism or neoliberal feminism, participants spoke of changing their family's mindset, and hope that this mindset change would happen in all families, and then that would bring about a broad-based societal change. So unlike neoliberal feminism, they were not talking about individual change. There was a recognition that things had to change at a broader level, but it had to happen at the community level first. It's in this context that participants overwhelmingly agreed that media can help, because most of them had heard of those people who had heard of feminism. They had heard of feminism because of media, so they credited media for having a space, for having heard of feminism. And yeah, their understanding of feminism is definitely flawed, especially when you think about how they were trying to you know uh, trying to say that feminism is not anti-men, it's not about women being greater than men, it's not about anti-morality, and that feminism must remain within limits. but there was still, the ways in which they spoke about how their own life had changed, or how it empowered them to think about certain issues, and how it empowered them to think about their own rights. um, it was fascinating, to say the least. So these participants who spoke about feminism also critiqued feminism for making it about men and women, without considering the diversity of experiences of people who are not cisgendered and heterosexual. And since participants seem to draw their understanding of feminism from popular media, which insists on a universal definition of equality between men and women as its key definition, then and predominantly addresses the cisgendered, heterosexual, middle class woman subject, it isn't surprising then that the participants were critiquing this as feminism's blind spot. So, on the whole, how did Hyderabadi millennials understand feminism? They understood variously as rights-based discourse that seeks to address and has succeeded to an extent the structural and systematic requirements needed to improve the status of women in terms of education, employment, wage gap, and political representation. As critique of social relations, where patriarchal culture of male domination fixes the position of women in the domestic sphere and makes it inferior. It devalues femininity and work that is characterized as feminine. They also thought of feminism as an enabler of choice that makes them aware that there are choices and that they must exercise it as a way of thinking that must be necessarily practiced or lived, because changing mindset is one thing, but if it is not practiced in the course of daily life, then it is limited to the level of rhetoric, which is what they said mediated feminism does. So, what is really required for social change is for this to be practiced. So feminism was variously understood as rhetoric, as politics, as micropolitics, actually, and I'll come to it in a bit, and also as practiced. And they mostly thought of feminism as about, as to do with azadi, despite the fact that they were okay with limited azadi to continue to protect their middle class respectability. And then I'll skip on gender politics, but let me assure you, because I don't have time, but let me just assure you that the ways in which they spoke about feminism was problematic, but also it was fascinating to see how they were using the feminist discourse to improve their own lives, which says something about agency in non-Western contexts. They were okay with towing the line so that first they could achieve those rights, and who knows if they might be able to push the boundary more. And another, quickly, if I can wrap up this, I'll just speak about how feminist mothers spoke about this. Now, feminist mothers belong to activist academic communities, so they were aware of intersectionality of the of different layers of oppression and how they intersect, and how these experiences make it difficult to categorize women as one whole group. So they spoke about trying to empower their kids, girls and boys, about respecting different identities, about respecting families that do not that are different from heteropatriarchal families, right? I mean, there are single mother households. There are households where you know uh, here I'm talking about LGBTQ, really. Women owned households or women headed households. So they were talking about, or even divorced women who are mothers, so they were talking about how it is important for their children to respect women, not just as mothers but as women, and that the identity of women is definitely not homogenic. And they were talking about how to raise their voices, especially for girl children. How do you raise your voice against any injustice, where usually middle class girls are supposed to be sehmi see, delicate and all of that. So they were trying to go against the grain, and they also did not mind if they hung out with women who are seen to be deviant in some way, single women, divorced women, or women who choose to identify as a part of LGBTQ community. They were more than happy for their kids to grow up around women like that. Um, basically, then why do I use the title micropolitics in this? And is it feminism at all? If you're depoliticizing feminism in such a way that feminism is narrowly understood as women's rights, as gender equality, and still towing the line of respectable femininities, then is it still feminism? One of the ways in which I try to grapple with this issue, first, let me come to micropolitics. Now, feminist mothering is definitely micropolitics because it's not talking about political collectivization of feminists at all. Right? And in contemporary times, feminism as practice is not limited to sloganeering and protesting on the streets. It includes a wide range of lifestyle choices. So there is definitely in scholarship as well, there is an extension of feminist activism from traditional academic activist settings, which is in the public eye, to non-traditional, possibly private spaces of the home. Recent scholarship also draws attention to the social circulation of feminist ideas, not just examining the rhetorical practices of feminist academics, scholars, and the texts they produce, but also extending it to the study of women's blogs, of conversations happening within the staff room, within the classroom, peer social community groups, families. So all of this are being studied as sides of feminist activism. So which has effectively expanded the sites and domains in which feminism is circulated and practiced, both at the collective and individual level, in both in private spaces and public spaces. And it expands the meaning of politics. Now one might argue that because modern forms of power, they're decentralized and they operate through everyday social practices along the everyday social fields, that's inclusive of family, friends, schools, workplace, right? Then the lens of micropolitics is useful because it helps us understand how feminism, that is not political because it's not visible on the streets, operates at the everyday level. Now, micropolitics then here refers to the level of the individual self, where the meaning of that self is relational. That is to say, how one's relation to the self and others is constructed and enacted depends upon the discourses available within that context. So, which is why middle class morality and respectability coincides with feminist discourses that are also very popular in the public discourse. So undeniably, micropolitics is contentious, because it arises out of lived experiences of individuals at the everyday level. It's not put into practice by a political community that is highly engaged in activism. And it has also been rightly critiqued for lacking political content. And to reduce the definition of what is politics and political claims. Um, but because the question that I was asking, it goes beyond their interpretation of feminism. After all, who is to say what authentic feminism is, to why they come to understand feminisms the way they do? Then here the lens of micropolitics is useful. It helps in acknowledging their situated analysis of their own gendered experiences and lives, and what makes feminism relevant to them, and how home becomes the site of, if not revolution, then at least negotiation. Now, I do offer critique about these kind of feminisms, which have lots of names. The kind of feminisms that respect middle class morality, that respect respectability, that want to perpetuate notions of respectability. They're called choice feminisms. They're called neoliberal feminisms. Many multiple new forms of feminisms, right? And I do address that in the thesis. But I also harbor hope. One, because it has taken years for middle class academic feminists to understand intersectionality and recognize that oppression can be experienced very differently. Right? So even today, Dalit feminists have to employ a diverse range of methods to make themselves heard. Like Savari is one example, because it isn't as simple as giving them a voice. They have a voice. It's about listening to them. And because those who spoke to me in the course of this research aren't academics or activists, and they hear about feminism from forces that are antithetical to feminism, popular culture, media, print, electronic, government initiatives, then it isn't surprising that this is how they interpret it. This is definitely problematic. But the hope is that just as feminism, as women's rights or gender equality has become such a commonsensical definition now, that if enough number of academic activist feminists keep at it, and if they keep hijacking movements like the Nirbhaya campaign, Kavita Krishnan's Bake Off Azadi is actually one such radical campaign that says that, freedom without limits, that is what we want. Freedom without care, freedom which is freedom and it's not about protectionism. That was radical. And she was successful at hijacking that movement to speak about such kind of radical politics, radical feminist politics. Then I harbor hope that one day feminism as intersectional, which is really about recognizing caste-based oppression as another layer on gender-based oppression, as another layer on caste-based oppression, class-based oppression, as another layer on sexuality-based oppression. These kinds of this understanding will also become commonsensical. That remains my hope. The current political climate doesn't seem to be conducive to this. But each time a right wing government has come into power, feminists have had to reflect on themselves and their politics and what it takes to resist. And to look at some of our laws now, there is a recognition, that women are not one category. Apart from class and caste, there's a recognition of those who are single women, who are divorced women, like I said. So then I feel like feminist activism of the organized kind, of the collective kind, can definitely hijack movements so that academic feminists can further the nuances that make intersectional feminism, and make an effort to make sure that these nuances enter popular consciousness and popular discourses. And for sure, micropolitics of this kind cannot and should not replace feminism of the collective kind, which is really which is oppositional and critical. Feminisms of the different kinds that participants speak of, living feminisms or cultural lifestyle feminisms, these are all problematic, and these notions must be challenged. But I think the fact that the vocabulary has entered, even as limited as it is, the vocabulary has entered popular consciousness and popular discourse, is something to, to will not be complacent about and be happy and, in a celebratory mood. But it is definitely nice to know that the vocabulary of caste, class, intersectionality is entering, not at the level that perhaps one hopes. um, but that, if if feminism as gender equality of or women's rights can become so commonsensical, then I think with enough effort, feminism in its original form, which has its roots in socialism and Marxism, then I feel like it's possible for the kind of radical vocabulary that feminism is really about can also enter popular consciousness and discourse in the everyday level. Thank you so much. Hello.
Thank you, Amulya. It was a great learning experience for all of us. I really liked, and I was not able to, even move away from the screen for a minute because of the way you were so engaged with the audience, and also sharing not just your experiences, but especially of the Hyderabadi women and men, because I also hail from Hyderabad, so that whole understanding the Hyderabadi mindset, which you attempted, I think was the cherry on the cake, because see, understanding feminism in India has been attempted by many, but to be narrowing it down to Hyderabad, I think that was the unique thing about your presentation. And there are many questions that have poured in, and I would like to tell you that throughout, I think around 16 to 12 participants were listening to every word that you were saying. So I think it is one of the best lectures we have had so far. So that is a proof of the talk. So let me begin by asking you the first question that has come in. So how do you think men react to the term feminism in Hyderabad? Like, you have interacted with men, so how did they react to being asked about feminism?
Yeah, I seem to have missed out on that aspect. So from the information that I mean, from the conversations I've had with men, one is that definitely not against feminism, which is very interesting, because in one sense, I think feminism then loses its political edge if people are using feminism so, casually. It would make more. But again, I think the way why they use the word feminism and why they're not against using the term feminism is because of their understanding of it as gender equality. Now, the moment you say gender equality, you're trying to say that it's not anti-men, it's not about women being greater than men. So they're complacent with the term. They're okay with the term. It's a double-edged sword. Definitely is a double-edged sword. It doesn't mean that, it's, oh, now everybody's saying that a feminist. It's not a happy occasion. And also, I think the fact that, for middle class feminists, I mean, for middle class men, at least it is possible for them to say, ki, oh, women's rights, yeah, women should be given this, women should be given that, because really they have the privilege to do so. They don't have to prove their masculinity, at least one kind of understanding of masculinity. But also, very interestingly, they spoke about reverse discrimination. Now, just as feminism is popular now, There's also a parallel movement called the men's rights movement. In India, that's very popular. Uh, Through the course of my research, I didn't meet an MRA, but it is very surprising and understandable why the MRA discourse is so popular amongst men here. They were quick to point out, feminism is great, women's rights is great, gender equality is great, but it doesn't mean that men should be discriminated against. For instance, some of the participants raised this issue about a local train incident. I don't know if how many of our audiences or how many of us remember this incident, but there was an incident where there was this innocent man who was just standing there, and a woman complained that he harassed her, and everybody started beating him. And then later on, they realized that that had not happened. It was a small tussle about a seat or something. And there was another incident about a traffic police officer. So MRAs on Twitter usually talk about fake Dory cases, fake harassment cases, and these are very popular with the men here as well. And they say that reverse discrimination is it's a huge a problem. And MRA discourse in India is so popular that there's a book called Popular Feminism, I think, by Laura Portwood Stacer, and she says that US MRA, US men's rights activists have links with men's rights activists in India, and they take India as an excellent example to forward men's rights. So it was an interesting dynamic. They were all about gender equality. As long as women are oppressed, as long as they feel that women are victims, they're fine with the word feminism. But it means that they have to check their own privilege, they have to check their own assumptions and their own power, then that's problematic.
Okay, this is pretty interesting. So the next question is, could you share the experiences of male participants? How did they feel? What are their experiences? Because that
Uh,
rarely comes out.
in reference with feminism or gender? Okay, anyway, let me address, maybe I can address both, because I hadn't spoken about experiences of male participants in relation with masculinities. I think they're at a point where male participants are okay with saying that taking care of children or the household isn't a threat to their masculinity. We are at that point. But again, we must acknowledge that these are middle class participants in middle class household, border work, right? Their work of taking care of children, taking care of cleaning, domestic work, really. These can be offloaded to women or men from disadvantaged class and classes. So for male participants, it was easy to say that, yeah, we are at a point, the current political, socio cultural movement is such that women don't have to take care of the households, and they don't feel a threat to their masculinity if they take care of children. But the reality is that they don't have to. Again, they don't challenge their power or their assumptions, and they don't feel a threat to their masculinity by saying it, because they don't have to do it. If they had to do it, perhaps it would be different, but they know that they don't have to do it. In fact, COVID pandemic was a great eye opener, right? I mean, the number of women who've complained that they had to take care of their children and also their husbands at the
True.
same time. And there was one woman who actually tweeted to Harsha Goenka that, please open offices. I can't take care of both my husband and children at the same time. So, yeah.
Some even in some countries like China, the divorce rate increased dramatically during the pandemic because women were not able to manage the men, being at home 24 hours. So
Yeah.
it led to a lot of problems and
Yeah.
domestic
There's
disputes.
There's this viral tweet by Chelsea Hart. I think she's a stand-up comic in the US, and she says that many men ask their women. She's obviously she's a comic, right? So she's saying that a lot of men ask their women to treat them like kings, and she's like, kings do a lot of work. They take decisions, but if you want me to treat like a king, then do all of this, because otherwise it's I can replace the word king with a toddler if I have to do everything for you.
True.
So it would be
I
the
like it.
same. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. So the next question is, do you think education and awareness about feminism has the potential to bring societal change in the long run?
I wouldn't just say that feminist politics is the only way for broader societal change. if feminism or feminist politics is understood very narrowly as women's rights. If we understand, I mean, there's this saying, right? If feminism is not intersectional, then it is not feminism at all. So, if there is awareness that caste based oppression, class based oppression, race, ethnicity, sexuality based oppression, ability based disability based oppression, if we don't acknowledge these oppressions is real, because they might be all these categories might be social constructions, but those who experience it, it's real for them, these are their lived experiences. Yeah, if you say that education would include, I mean, I know for a fact that CBSE has now does have a section on Indian women's movements and feminism. If if people read, and if they're self-reflexive, really thinking about their, it is easy to say that, oh, caste was never an issue in my household, caste was never a discussion in my household, we are not castes. That does not help. We have to understand how caste is real and how people experience that oppression. We have to engage with those who experience that oppression, acknowledge their experiences, and then make an effort to uh, to bring about a change within ourselves. And because we are also sources of socialization, we might have kids one day, to make sure that they grow up knowing why it is a problem and what it takes to dismantle such oppressions. Then broad-based societal change is possible. And I feel like academic feminists, activists, and activist feminists who do intersectional politics of the kind that is intersectional, and if we all put an effort together, then it's definitely possible, because Twitter is a great place. I mean, you see so much, even something like gig economy, which is so new to India, platformization, platform aggregators like urban companies, these are new, but there is a robust discussion about how platforms exploit workers. So, despite the fact that it's so new, there is a public discourse, right? Which is the potential that Twitter offers. And now with Rumana Chowdhury, I think Twitter will prove to be a good place. Not everything has to be a part of school curriculum, although it's really great it is. And we also see that there's an attack on history textbooks, right? Reworking what history means, what it contains. So if education in the school is not going to address these, then I think one must. I think civil society activists must take it upon themselves, because who- really, what is active citizenship if you're not trying to engage and educate people who are. Now again, this is not educating the disadvantaged classes and castes. This is not about
Yeah,
educating top down, right? Yeah,
yeah, thank you for answering that. That is quite thought provoking. So
different
the
as
next question,
fathers.
yeah,
Yeah. Do you think these millennial men from Hyderabad who are aware of feminism will be different as fathers? So in my research, I did speak to men, and what would they do differently? I asked them what they learned about, what they like best about their mothers, fathers, and all of that. And not surprisingly, almost all of them said that they had a very distant relationship with their fathers, which is how typical Indian patriarchal family is, right? Mothers are emotionally closer. And in my family, as I mentioned, my father had to go away for work. So for them, they definitely want a relationship with their children that is different from what they've experienced. But because I spoke with middle class men, I feel it is easy to say that they would like to be active fathers, they would like to take part in child rearing and cleaning and domestic work, because they know that they don't have to do it. Because this border work, this care work is offloaded to women, mostly women, but also men. Like in Mumbai, there are male workers, domestic workers. So, but they're aware that these kinds of works can be offloaded to women from disadvantaged classes. You have nannies, you have domestic workers. So I think unless I conduct a longitudinal research and speak to them when they
yeah,
become
again,
fathers,
after
yeah,
after they become fathers, yeah.
yeah, yeah. But right now they seem to be saying that they'd like to be engaged fathers.
But it's easier said than done, you know. At
Exactly,
least in my
exactly.
experience, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's hope that they, actually adhere to what they are used for. So the next, I think this is the last question for the day. It has been observed that all talk of feminism has led to plain rhetoric for the working men and sometimes even women. How do you overcome this problem? Because in offices and all, you see that politically being politically correct is very important in a corporate job. So this all this talk of feminism, I think somewhere has led to being politically correct and the rhetoric on women rights, education, and how they should be spoken to, respect, and everything. But it remains a problem that it has just boil down to becoming a rhetoric and nothing more. So how do you think you can overcome this problem?
You know what they say, when you repeat a lie enough, it starts to become the truth. I wouldn't dismiss rhetoric completely. We know I mean, you worked on political rhetoric, so you know the value of rhetoric, right? So it's good that there's rhetoric, that there are people talking about it. But like I mentioned in the presentation, I don't know if I dealt it in a lot of depth, but participants were also talking about living feminisms. Living feminisms, mane, the choices that can be termed as feminist. Now, what is feminism is hugely problematic. I mean, I hope that I've covered that during the presentation. But they were talking about how you must make choices that are closer to the values that you seem to say that you believe in, right? How do we overcome this problem? Especially because you're talking about corporate governance, there's a lot of talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. In terms of India, there's progressive reservation, right? Now, these are all steps that have come about because of a certain rhetoric at a certain point of time. If there's no talk, in general, the action will be lax. So what I feel is like, rhetoric is good, but how do we overcome this problem? I think to be self accountable and reflexive. I think a part of my thesis is also about micropolitics, right? When I say micropolitics, I'm talking about everyday stuff. Now, there's this word called microaggression. Not all kinds of discrimination happen only at the structure. The moment you say structural, systematic oppression or discrimination, if you are removing the individual from that structure, then you're depersonalizing the discrimination. You are not going to think about how you are a part of the problem. It is important to think and reflect about how you are a part of the problem, what you're doing it. There is a lot of lip service, agreed, but if it can help, it's not an easy question to answer. How do we overcome this problem? Deep engagement, and trying to be self accountable, and realizing when you're committing these acts of microaggression, like, for instance, not giving a glass of water or using a different glass of water. These might seem like very small things to a middle class person, but the person who's experiencing it, not getting a glass of water, not getting a glass which everybody uses, that is different, right? So I guess empathy, really, empathy, care and empathy are and feminism also talks about empathy and ethic of care.
I actually applaud you for even attempting to answer this question, because yeah, there is so much you can actually say or do. You know, it is eventually the person who himself has to realize and be self-aware and actually follow, just not give lip service. I think Amulya, on behalf of everyone, I would like to thank you for this thought-provoking talk with the examples, anecdotes. You made it so much more interesting and so relatable. I'm sure when I say that it was a great learning experience for all of us, and your delivery was also very lucid, so it was not very difficult to follow, and I think the whole experience was amazing. Thank you once again for agreeing to join us and giving this lecture on our platform. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the members, the days who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible, and also the participants who have graced us with their presence and shown their support and enthusiasm for participating through questions and actually sitting through the whole 1.5 hours. So thank you once again, everyone. I hope you have a great evening ahead, and we hope to see all of you in our next event. This is a book discussion on October 2nd at 3 p.m. This is going to be our first book on economics, so we are all very excited. The book is called Microeconomics and Introduction by Alex Thomas. He is an ex-alumni of the Hyderabad Central University Department of Economics, so we are very keen to learn from him. His book is also available on Amazon. So, if in case you want to read the blurb before joining us for the event, thanks once again, and thank you once again, Amulya, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ariba, and thank you, Airs, for hosting me.
Bye bye.
Thanks to all the participants. Bye bye.